2 feet.
Good,
Yeah.
good. Well, shall we get started? I have 1 minute past the hour. What do you think, Alicia?
Sounds good to me. I'm ready when you
Okay.
are.
All right. So we're going to test out our sharing. It worked last time, so wish us luck this time. Um, and I'm going to share screen. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do.
Go to slideshow.
Slideshow. Yeah. All right. Everyone see a nice big purple slide? Great. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Alexia Jaouich. I'm at Step Care Solutions. I'm a psychologist by training, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Step Care 2.0. But as you see from our title here, Alicia and I will be presenting about one-at-a-time core components, supporting training and implementation. And this is a piece of work that we've been working on for probably over a year with other, we use one at a time and single session therapy interchangeably. We find that lots of the places we work, both clients and providers, like the concept of one at a time, the language of one at a time, feeling like it really promotes the idea that every interaction can be meaningful, can be helpful. But also say that we did this work with other trainers that work at Step Care Solutions, Monty Bobel, Arnie Slive, Janice Dawson, and Dana Warren. And of course, Alicia and I and a few others developed this idea of core components. So we're going to tell you a bit about what core components are and what we came up with and how we think it can be useful. And so I'll just turn it over to Alicia to introduce herself as well.
Yeah, so it's so lovely to be kind of back in this space and seeing so many familiar faces. And also, I'm just really excited to see all of you here because this is going to be maybe a little bit of a different kind of a presentation because we're going to talk about this thing called implementation. And the impact of this work that we do in the system. So this is kind of new for me. I began my life as a clinician, as a psychotherapist here in Canada. Step Care is a Canadian. We should probably mention that too, Alexia, that we are based in Canada, but doing work all over the place. But my origins are as a clinician. But this is sort of a larger kind of long-term passion of mine to think about how we fit in these larger mental health systems, because I think that's a challenge for us doing this work sometimes in the medical model. And this is where I found home these days. So it's really lovely to get to share this work with all of you in this space. So thank you for coming.
All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of context, and then Alicia's going to dive into the practice of what the practice core components how they can be helpful to clinical work, to training, to supervision, etc. But just to give you a bit of context of who we are, just like Alicia was saying, we're a not-for-profit Canadian organization, and we developed a model called Step Care 2.0. And part of the Step Care 2.0 model, the idea is that we really want to create a system that provides open access and flexible person-centric care. Person-centric care. Our services are often excellent, but the system, quote unquote system, is not organized in a way to make services really accessible and to get really care at that point of need, at a point of reaching out. And so our person who developed Step Care 2.0, and since then, the premise is how do we create systems and services that provide more open access and really meet the client where they're at in their journey. And so you can imagine that one at a time therapy and what we've thought through a one at a time approach to care across the continuum of services is really critical. It's a feature of the Step Care 2.0 model. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But sometimes our core of our work is working, for example, with a government in Canada, with either a province or a territory. We're now working internationally, and the government is saying, our clients are often governments or leaders of organizations saying, the system doesn't work. This isn't working for us. We need to redesign this. Our people, when they access services, they need to access services. And so we're not providing our support is to think through how do you do that differently? And how do you provide services in a really accessible way? So I said a lot of these things already, but really the Step Care 2.0 model is to provide a range of services, and services can be all sorts of services, from peer support to workshops to ongoing therapy to one at a time therapy to just reading a bit of information on a website that can be really helpful for people, to crisis. The whole continuum is critical. and people need to have access to what's going to meet their needs when they need it. Right, so that's really the underlying premise here, in that people can direct their own journey. They're experts in their own lives, and so the principles of Step Care 2.0 align very well with the principles of one at a time therapy, single session therapy. And so for us, it's very much integrated, and we'll tell you a little bit more about how. So we know that when governments, leaders want to implement system change, there's often lots of really important principles, like making services more accessible. But when it comes to like, how do we do that? It's really tricky, right? It's not that simple. So we developed what we call core components of the Step Care 2.0 model. Things like you have to co-design your system with people who are using services and providers. You actually need a range of services, right? Only providing ongoing therapy is not going to meet everyone's need. And it creates a bottleneck in terms of everyone waiting for the same thing. That it needs to be recovery oriented. We need to trust in people's journeys and knowledge of themselves to decide what's best for them, what services meets their needs, etc. That people need access to same day support. And then you see in a box here highlighted that a critical component of the Step Care 2.0 model is that there is a one at a time approach, including one at a time therapy. So yes, therapy is critical, but we think that when you think of one at a time thinking, which we know the mindset can be applied to all services, right? So yes, one at a time therapy is critical, but you can have a one at a time mindset to peer support, to groups, to workshops. We know that there's a lot of professionals that don't do therapy that can still very much utilize those skills. So we've developed training at Alesya leads around called OAT skills, right? So you're not doing therapy, but how do you still use that mindset to make every moment, every interaction count? So again, just to give a bit of context of who we are and where this is coming from us, these are the steps that we talk about in terms of every system needs to have access to a range of supports for the whole population. And sometimes that includes informal supports, what exists in the community already. It doesn't have to be just formal mental health services. We know that cultural, traditional, religious, and just community-based services are really helpful to people. So we want to really promote that there's a range of options for people, and that we see single session therapy at this level 7, which is there's lots of kinds of therapies. There's ongoing therapy, but there's also single session therapy, brief therapies, all slew of kinds of therapies. They all fit in this step 7. But before you get to step 7, there's a lot of other options too. The higher we go up, the more formal services we're talking through here. So I mentioned peer support at step 3, workshops at step 4. Peer support has certainly evolved over the years. It's not just a step 3. You can get peer support in crisis services, peer support in group services, all sorts. But for us, it's just highlighting where we see single session therapy, one at a time therapy is at a step 7. When we work with these governments or leaders of organizations, and they say we want to reorganize our services, often a pain point is wait times. It's a huge pain point. We work internationally in South America, in the UK, it's the same issue of wait times, right? What we've seen is when they often start with implementing one at a time therapy in an open access way, right? Come in any day, anytime. You can get a one at a time session. Wait lists drop dramatically to almost no wait times, right? Because
I wonder,
most,
Alexia, if it's worth just taking a minute just to make
yeah,
sure that everybody kind of clarifies and knows actually what we mean by one at a time therapy and single session therapy. Like, just wondering if, just wanting to clarify that
sure.
everybody understands that when we're talking about single session therapy or any kind of one at a time encounter, that the mindset around that is that every encounter, regardless of which step you're on here, we should be able to make the most of that encounter. So it means we believe that every encounter has value and that it is the job of the service provider, whoever that service provider is, peer support, coach, digital intervention, therapist, whatever, to actually utilize that session for something that's good for the client as directed by the client. So in step care, we've chosen to use the word one at a time as opposed to single session because it really is a one at a time model where people might come back, right? They could not. They might come to different services. They might not. We don't know for sure. we're not going to judge that, determine that, or influence that in any way, shape, or form. The term single session therapy can sometimes be a little bit reductive because it implies one and done. That's not the model that we're talking about here. So, what we're talking about again is this idea that we want people to be building relationships with the system rather than the individual. And I just wanted to clarify that,
Well,
Alexia, because
that's
I know,
helpful. Thank you,
yeah,
Alicia. Sometimes
just to
it's hard
make
to.
sure that we all
Mhm.
are on the same page about what we're talking about. So, yeah,
Absolutely. Lots of terms, and we're all
yeah,
coming from different places and worlds. And so it's important to clarify some of this language piece. So thank you for doing that,
yeah.
Alicia. Um, yeah, so just as an example, when people start implementing, and these are large systems with, a whole millions of people in a province or a territory, they start implementing this, the wait lists drop dramatically, which is a huge pain point for people, right? When they reach out for help, they would prefer to have support now, not in 3 months or 4 months. That creates an ongoing harm for folks, as many of you know. So I'm going to stop there for a second. Like you said, Alicia, any thoughts? Or we're a smallish group. If there's any thoughts or questions, feel free. I should have said that at the beginning. Put a hand up, put something in the chat. We don't want to be going too fast, but part of it is that we wanted to make sure we had some time at the end for discussion. So part of why I'm not spending a ton of time on all this intro is because we want to have time for discussion. But if there's something that benefits from some clarification, please jump in. Okay. So, as I was describing, we're helping provinces, territories, organizations, universities implement a different kind of system. That's a big piece of work that can feel very overwhelming. So, what we've done over time is we've used an implementation science framework. How do we do this? We have this, we are not a lack of good ideas in the mental health and addiction system. We have good ideas of what could improve things for people, but the execution, and I said this is a royal we now internationally, is tricky, especially when we're thinking of system change. So we've adopted a methodology to help us just more concretely move through this process. This methodology called implementation science, this is a bit of a simplified formula saying in order to get outcomes, the socially significant outcomes that we want, we need a few things. We need good interventions, innovations, in this case, Step Care 2.0, or in this particular case, one at a time therapy. We need that to be implemented well, right? So that involves good training, good supervision. If it's going to be open access, it requires changes in documentation, how people come through an intake. Do they do an intake? Do they just come for a one-at-a-time session? There's like things that look different if you're going to do a single session therapy in an open access kind of way. So we need to think through what the things are that needs to be changed, and then the context is really important. How you implement the context around, like if this is called kind of the where. If you're doing this in Chile versus in Wales versus in a small rural community versus an urban center, it's going to look different. And there's different characteristics to think about, different contexts, history, culture, population, resources, etc. And we need to attend to all of these things. Having strong innovations, in this case, one at a time therapy, we need good methods to implement it, and we need to consider all the context around that implementation. Is there anything you would add, Alicia?
No, I think that's exactly it. And I think again to be aware sort of for our purposes, because I know a lot of us are clinicians, that one of the exciting things and the focus of this is to think about how we're all fitting into the relationship with the larger system. Because I think one of the barriers clinically that a lot of us face is that we want to practice in a solution focused way, or we want to adopt these things, but we don't have a system that allows us to be able to manage within that in a way that works and is in alliance or that aligns with our belief system or what we hope to be or the ways in which we're hoping to be practicing. So this is this idea of like, how do we do that? How do we create a system that enables and supports and strengthens our work is really kind of, one of the exciting pieces, I think, of this. Would you
Mm-hmm.
say, or for me anyways, because I'm coming at it for sort of from a clinical perspective. But yeah, so I think to always remember that it's kind of like this is how we're relating to the world around us.
Mhm.
right? And trying to develop a system that works, in alignment with how
Yeah.
we'd like to practice. So,
Yeah. And part of like what just to provide some of the other side of the coin on this one is I'm a clinician as well. I've done clinical work for a long time. I think, like I said at the beginning, clinical services are usually quite good. It's
yeah,
usually not the problem. The problem often is and people knowing where the services are, how to access them, services, being able to access more than one service and not having to repeat themselves. How, if they're getting services from more than one provider, that being integrated and collaborative. Those are the challenges that regardless of where we work, clinicians are doing good work. Peer supporters are going to work. That's not usually the challenge. The challenge is all the stuff around the services. Hence why my move was to move from clinical work to thinking of like, how do we improve our systems to enable clinicians to do the good work for clients. So you'll see here that the box that's circled here is effective innovations because we're focusing on the intervention here. We're focusing on one-at-a-time therapy. Our experience is we've been doing training and implementation of one-time therapy for 5 to 6 years. And people still require a lot of support to understand what is it and what would I do differently if I was doing one-time therapy, what it would look like. And so what we done over the years and really focused in the last year is how do we describe what one-at-a-time therapy looks like in enough detail that clinicians know what to do, right? Because I mean, I've done lots of clinical training, really good ideas, principles, and then I'm off to the session. I'm like, oh, I'm not sure how to apply these principles in practice. And that's the case for lots of our mental health services. We often have a description. I'm going to use a really simple one. If we think of client-centered care, right? If you ask a group of 100 clinicians, from psychiatrists to social workers to mental health nurses, peer support, do you do client-centered work? They're going to say yes, right? No one's going to say, no, I'm not client-centered. But if we each had to define and describe what that looks like in practice, it would be quite different. We'd lots of differences around what we do in our session that is client-centered, right? So here is there's this concept of effective innovations. In order to have an effective innovation, we need, yes, to have clear values. We need to identify what are the core components, what are the core components of client-centered care. And if we were all, we were about 25, 30 people here, if we came to consensus around what are the core ingredients, key ingredients of client-centered care, that'd be really helpful. And then we would have to describe in practice what would we see if a therapist, a peer supporter, or whoever was doing client-centered care in enough detail that you can then take that and help support a clinician provider to go do that work. That level of operational definition isn't often in our training or in kind of clinical sphere. More and more it is. I'm not going to say it's not, but it's quite variable in terms of what level of description um, that helps us kind of go do our work. And then lastly, you need some sort of way to assess whether that's happening in practice. Now, we're not saying like a harsh evaluative process. We're just saying like, if these 5 criteria are what make client-centered care, am I doing those? A bit of self-reflection, am I doing these 5 things, etc. So I gave the client-centered example, a very simple example that is just a bit lighter and fun and I use this exercise a lot in terms of if we were all trying to find the core components of chicken soup, the question is, what makes chicken soup chicken soup? And we would probably come up with a few answers. Someone might say chicken, obviously. And then someone might say noodles. And then someone else might say, actually, I don't like noodles in my chicken soup. I like rice. Okay, well, there's a question there. Are noodles or rice a core component? And then we would go, like, I like carrots. Well, I don't like carrots. And it's coming down to, through a discussion, what are the core components that make chicken soup chicken soup? Usually after an exercise like that, we get to, you need chicken, you need some sort of broth, and you need a container. So years ago, when I did this exercise, I was saying bowl. And we need a bowl. And then someone was saying, actually, I like mine in a cup. So then it led to, okay, well, fair enough, container, right? And I use this very simple, silly analogy because it starts getting really clear what is critical to make chicken soup. And we wanted to do the same thing for single session therapy. What is critical for single session therapy to be single session therapy, not something else, not brief therapy, not psychodynamic therapy, not CBT, but what is unique to single session therapy, one at a time therapy. So that's what core components are. And it helps on a few levels. One, it helps get agreement amongst a group of people. What is it that we're implementing? What is it that we're all doing here together? And so that's really important. We have 5 trainers. We have 2 that are a little more peripheral, but 5. And are we all training the same thing? Are we all doing the same thing? We thought so. We think so, but are we sure that we all understand single session therapy the same way? So that was part of like, are we all on the same page? What do we all think it would look like to do when we see a clinician do good single session therapy? I'm gonna say sometimes I go back between one time therapy and single session therapy, but for me, I use them interchangeably um, because those are the active ingredients. That's what we think leads to change for clients, right? So the core components are the what, how people deliver those what's. So how a therapist gets agreement on what's the focus of the session is like agreeing on the focus of the session being a core component. How I do that versus how Alesya does that might look different because we have our own style, our own language, our own, training. So that's kind of like what we call about in the core component in the soup analogy. Those are the spices. We can all add spices and additional ingredients, but at the core, Alesya and I still need to be doing some of these 3 same things. We can add stuff. Adding things are not gonna dilute the fact that we're still doing those 3 things. So how it looks can look different. So we're not saying every clinicians have to do this in the same way. And same thing for the training. Training can look different. Our trainers do training a bit differently, coming from different places and experiences, but they all need to make sure that what they're training to are these core components. So that was the work we did. And now I'm going to turn it over to that was the intent. Now Alesya's going to talk through what the experience was to do that for one at a time therapy.
Yeah. And I just want to like pause here because I know we've thrown kind of a lot of concepts at you kind of really quickly. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about this at this point, like just as a bit of a check-in point before we get into the more detailed stuff. What do we think so far? Are we getting how this might be useful to us in practice? I see Jonas nodding heads, but yeah, thoughts about that at all?
I love the soup analogy.
Yeah.
It's so simple yet so effective. I
Yeah.
hope you didn't copyright that.
No, you know what's really funny is I'm like, Alesya, I do the soup analogy all the
Yeah.
time. Is it really useful? She's like, yes, it is. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
So much better than a melting pot.
Well, yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I really love about this for me personally is that it does allow people to be unique, right? Like there's no judgment about it, right? Because it allows people to be like, yeah, if you want to add dill to your soup, awesome. If you want to add pepper, awesome. If you want it to be like, and I think that that for me is kind of where this allows us to be inclusive. And it kind of takes away like that conflict that I feel can sometimes permeate these discussions of what are we doing, and then it just turns into, well, if you're not doing it this way, then you're not doing it at all, right? And I think that having a framework like this really allows us to honor and respect the vast differences that people bring to all of this work. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about this. So yeah, I love the analogy too. Thanks, Aisha. Any other
So,
thoughts on this?
Elisa, no, I have just one that's like kind of weird. But first time I saw you, you said not a melting pot, but a salad. How did you go from a salad to a soup?
I talked to Alexia. I can't take credit for this one.
I was thinking she's gonna say it was too cold for a salad, but
No, this is, I mean, I have to say honestly, I mean, this implementation thing, and Alexia can attest to this, it took a minute for her to convince me that there was value in doing this, like all of us, like all of the training people that were doing this. I think Alexia did an extraordinary job of kind of being like, yes, this is why. Yes, this is why. Yes, this is why. And then finally I was like, oh, okay. Right. But then, I mean, we'll talk about this a bit more, but then going through the process, it really makes you reflect on what actually matters here. Like, what are the things that really, I don't know if define is the right word, but that really mark the work that we all do. So I can't take credit for any of that. This is an Alexia driven driven project. So yeah. Anything else around that? Any questions or clarifications?
I love this the soup as well, and it's distracted me from the thing that I was hooked onto from before, because that was like the curvy thing you showed about, and you said something really interesting from a systems perspective, that people can enter the services at any point and crisscross through them. And I know that a lot of systems are built linearly, like you start here and then you progress through the system if it's necessary. I just love this thought. And I'm going to listen very intently to find the language to convince other people that it might work this way. And the other gem that you said is you need to make every session in every part of that framework count. They need to be the best you can deliver. And because it might be the only one for a long time, and it needs to matter. So thank you for that. Brilliant. I hope we get the slides at some point, or the recording, and then we'll study it. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. So, I mean, just kind of getting into the nitty gritty, and that's a great segue. Thank you for that, Pout, because again, one of the things that we're trying to do at Step Care is, because we see the system as a whole and doing single session therapy or OAT therapy as a whole, one of the challenges that we were given were to develop core components that would not just apply to therapy, but apply all across the entire system. So what we're going to be presenting to you today are the ones that are most relevant to the SST, or that, because that's kind of where the origin of a lot of this works. I am sure as you see them that most of us in the solution focused community are going to see many points of intersection, I would say. Certainly I come to this work as a solution focused practitioner. And when I look at the values behind single session, I feel like, you know, whether it was intended to be or not, certainly solution focused is a one at a time model, right? Even before we had that terminology, I think that it started that way. You know, our whole orientation about treating every session as first and last really aligns strongly. So I think that even though this isn't, these are one at a time core components, I actually think that they are very useful for all of us in the solution focused community, because I think that they still hold. And I'll be curious, and we'll be curious to kind of hear your thoughts about that as well. But another person on our team came up with this lovely, lovely diagram that I think really illustrates a lot of the things that certainly, in my experience, solution focus has also struggled with a little bit, which again is this difference between, you know, what is the mindset? I mean, we talk about the single session mindset quite frequently in the literature, but then there's also the solution focused mindset, which is a feature of the solution focused literature, right? So clearly we believe in these orientations that there is a mindset factor. And I think what often happens, though, when we're reading the literature is we confuse mindset, we confuse the why with the what and the how. And I think, again, what we tried to do is we tried to isolate that. So if you look at this little diagram, on the one hand, we have the mindset, which is really the why do we take this approach? So that's the belief system, is another word that sometimes we talk about that, right? So what is the belief that we have to have before going into every session? And I think in single session and in solution focused, we have very specific beliefs about how we see the people that we are working with in front of us. We choose to see them from a position of capacity. We choose to focus on what people are doing well. We choose to believe that they have the ability to make good decisions. And these mindset things are often connected to values, right? Or are often just connected to kind of core beliefs or a belief in the way that we operate through the world. Now we know that the consequences of having those beliefs, or that there are consequences of that from an action perspective. These are largely, again, the core components. So the core components are really the what we do. So if you believe that people are experts in their own life, that has to show up in the work that we do in some way, shape, or form. If people are experts in their own life, then we believe probably in some level they need to be asked the question, what do you think is right for you? How you go about asking that question may vary according to language, culture, expectation, all of the stuff. It may begin with, what are your best hopes from us talking today? Or it may be like, what's the most important thing on your mind? Or it may be like, when you think of like an ideal service, what would it look like? Those are the skills and techniques. Those can change. Now, in the land of single session, there is a belief that we are agnostic in the approach, that it's not one approach. So single session literature doesn't marry itself to a particular model. So there are some single session therapists that do it from a CBT perspective, others that are narrative, others that are whatever. The core components have to be able to be present and okay with all of the models, and that is the challenge. How you do it, SF, narrative, AI, like whatever it is, that's the skills and techniques, but the core components are the things that bridge the mindset to the techniques. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Next slide, if we can, maybe. So I think we've already talked about this, right? But there's a lot of purposes of the core components. A big one is if we can agree on the core components, then we can train to the components. So how we go about doing that may vary in terms of training, but we want all of our learners to be able to leave a training being able to enact the core components in some way, shape, or form. The other thing is this really offers a model or an opportunity for a fidelity tool, like a self-fidelity tool for supervision. There's all kinds of things that we can use to be able to say, did you hit these marks in every encounter? Another one is clarity. At least now we're speaking the same language. We're all going towards the same thing, and here they are. Consistency and common understanding across practitioners. This hopefully bypasses the my model is better than yours discussion, because we're not even doing that anymore. So hopefully this is a way of just completely bypassing all of those little rabbit holes that we tend to fall into. And then the other one is a support scaling, right? As we can move it up or down, get bigger or smaller as needed. The next one, maybe, if we can, Alexia. Okay, so these are our 5 that it took us many months and many discussions to be able to work with. And like I said, there's been lots and lots of iterations of this, but these are the ones that we've landed on. And I would be interested to hear, from all of you what you think about this, because, we've done this again with our sort of internal people or our internal training team. I think maybe one of our next steps is to kind of get other feedback from other people. So, I mean, this is just sort of a starting place, and it's quite dynamic. But the first one here is around every encounter centers what is important to the client. And remember again that these core components are not necessarily just for therapy sessions. So we want these core components to be across the board. So that's why I think we've intentionally kind of used the word center. So in a therapy context, it might be focusing on what's important to the client in the session, but in a case management moment, it might be different, right? So again, we want these to be broad enough to be able to include all of it. Yeah. And the idea about encounter as well, right? Alexia added that in the chat. I don't know if there's anything else about kind of some of the intentionality of language, Alexia, that you wanted to add to around any of these?
Well, sometimes we're fussed on the word client, because if you think of the 9 steps, if you're accessing a digital service online that's totally self-guided, are you a client? Probably like a user of that digital service. User isn't, but user doesn't sound great when you think of a therapy, like a service user. So some systems use the word service user. We debated that because when you think of like, mental health literacy at step one, you're not a client, but you want that encounter of accessing mental health literacy material about anxiety on the web to be useful. So that's where it would apply. So sometimes, maybe at some point we'll change client because that doesn't apply always to the earlier steps. But anyways, for this purpose, it's fine because we're mostly thinking of talking about therapy.
Yeah. And I think we've had discussions about that too. I mean, it's
Yeah.
amazing how, and that we haven't even tried to translate these, and I mean a little bit, but not, so I think, yeah, there's lots of things with that. There's other words too, right? Like the word useful. I think amongst ourselves, we like to sort of think of, I mean, I personally don't like the word helpful or helping, right? Because I think that sort of implies that we are there to help others, instead of really viewing clients as having the ability to help themselves, right? So, every encounter is experienced as useful sort of changes that kind of thing as well. At step care, again, even though I think it's impossible to ever kind of level the playing field in terms of power dynamics between service providers and people, we do our best. Right. And I think it's these little things that actually count a lot when we're thinking about what's the intentionality, which is the fifth one, right, around how we approach people every time we are seeing them. The third one here, of course, is quite important, and I don't know, maybe less important from a solution-focused context, but this idea of every encounter is designed to stand alone as a complete experience. So that's when I think that what does that actually mean? So what do we do to ensure that it has the ability to stand alone, right? And I think that changes kind of from model to model. But again, somehow there has to be a design of the session itself to be able to say, you don't need to come back, and what came before also is not actually relevant or relevant clinically to what's happening in this moment right now. The fourth one, again, is the identifying and mobilizing. And again, notice that in some strength-based approaches, what often ends up happening is that all we're doing is identifying the things that are going well. And I think that for us, one of the important things is that we actually mobilize them as well. So we're not just there to kind of make lists of all of the things that are great. We're actually there to use them in some way, shape, or form in terms of next steps. And then the last one here, of course, is that every encounter is flexible and intentional. And for us, the intentionality around that means that we have to really do a lot of work and ongoing training to really commit to doing this as best we can. So, yeah. Good. The next one, I think that we're going to maybe pause here for just a minute. And I don't know if we even want to maybe stop sharing the screen just for a second.
Well, you have a question already that came up right as we were sharing that this slide. Paul asked, what I find interesting is that the second one, I'll just go back, about the encounter being useful is from the client's perspective and reflective, as opposed to the other ones who are within the things a therapist does. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, I wonder if when we look at the practice profile, it will all become clear. So we'll take a minute for that. Any other questions, and then we'll see how that looks. A little bit. Thoughts? What do you think about these guys? We like them? Don't like them? Things that are missing, not missing? What do you think?
I guess I'm still kind of stuck on the fourth one. Similar to the first question of similar to the first question of the clinician using these as opposed to the client. But I was curious about like what you meant by internal and external resources, like what, if you could give an example of what that might look like. And you said to use them in any shape or form. So what, like, is that from the service provider using them, or the client kind of identifying and mobilizing that they can use them within and outside of session.
Yeah. So we believe that in every single session, in every single encounter, that it is the clinician's job to identify and mobilize the resources of the client. So again, how they go about doing that is up to them. From an SF perspective, we have lots of ways of doing this. Can you tell me about a time when you were most calm? That is a question that identifies and mobilizes existing internal and external resources. Why? Because in the course of answering that question, they're going to identify and acknowledge, one, that they have the ability to be calm, and also probably how they went about doing that. So it's both the what is it and the how of it that really matters. And I think, again, sometimes we get caught on this list making of, oh, you're calm. Oh, you have cats. Oh, you have a car. Oh, you have a job. Oh, you have a, right? And I think that that can sort of be a little bit like surface level and kind of a bit performative. But if we think, okay, so why does it matter that you have a car? Well, what does that mean? It means that somehow, somewhere along the line, you have managed to have enough money or enough of a job to be able to buy a car and then pay for gas. And what do you do with the car? Like, in all of those kinds of things, right? So, yeah, great. Jonas,
Yeah,
and is
thanks for clarifying
that good,
that.
Roland?
That's
Yeah.
really helpful because I
Is it?
was like, oh my gosh, how do like I can see that I know how to identify, but the mobilizing, I'm like, what does that look like? So thank you for that question of like, tell me what a time you were calm, because I'm like, oh, I do that all the time.
Of
So
course. Yeah. And I think that the wonderful thing about this is it forces us to kind of label what we're doing, right? It like, it's, I mean, in SF, we do this all the time, right? I say like, a lot of times change or things happen. And unless we take a minute to notice them, it's like we don't give value to it, right? So I think that having a tool like this, if you want to call it that, or a framework, really allows us to be like, am I doing this? And if I'm unsure of it, what would need to happen or what would I want to see happen so that I could say, yes, absolutely, I've just done this thing clinically. Yeah, great. That's a good question. Jonas.
Yeah, I'm just hung up on the word flexible. And as it comes as the last one, I'm kind of like, well, my first reaction was, does that mean everything above is negotiable? Can we change everything because we can be flexible, right? But then I'm thinking about it too, and on the same level as the fifth one there, that's flexible and intentional. That could be paradoxical in itself. I'm trying to do one thing, with purpose, but I'm holding it so lightly I can change with any minute. That becomes paradoxical. So I was wondering if you could speak to more about what you mean by the flexibility when it comes to these core components. I think it's great, and I can get it, but I wonder if it could also be misinterpreted.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I wonder, Beverly, if this is also a little bit, maybe you asked the question, I see, how do you weight the components, right? So maybe I'm misunderstanding that. But these components are not written in order of priority. Like these components all have equal value. Like what we hope to see, and I'll move to it in a minute, but we develop these things called practice profiles as well. And maybe that would be helpful to kind of, I'll just show you one as an example right now. But the idea is that we want all of these things to be present in all and every session. So the next step after identifying the core component, and each core component has one of these, is to also fill in this thing called a practice profile. So this actually was where the nitty-gritty stuff really came into it. This is like where we had to spend a lot of time. And Alexia is laughing because she knows like how much. And I have to say, like, we did a presentation on this. When was that, Alexia, the SST5, like not that long ago. What, of May? Maybe 6 months?
May or June? May,
Yeah.
June.
And when I reopened this slide deck for this one, I was like, oh, I don't even know where these things came from, and completely changed this one for this core component. So this is for sure like an iterative process that we've kind of gone around and around and around. But this table actually is one of the most useful things that I've ever encountered in my whole life as a clinician, because again, it really forces you to think about what should be here. So if you look at these categories, and just we couldn't do it and keep it on one slide, but this is also supposed to be meant to be read horizontally as well. So it's vertically, but also horizontally. So each of these kind of link to one another. But so if you think about this first one here, right? That the ideal implementation. So this is what we think about as the gold standard. So this is what we would want to see in every single session is for the third one, the clinician and client begin every session with the establishment of the client's priority. That's the gold standard. Now, the acceptable variation, so sometimes it's kind of like the silver one, like if this is gold, then this is the silver one, is that we acknowledge that the client might have many priorities that may be addressed in a future session. So if you think about how that relates to this core component, which is every encounter is designed to stand alone, then gold standard is that we're just going to establish the one. The middle ground, which happens quite frequently, is we might acknowledge and realize that a person has lots of things that they want to talk about, and they might come back for another one. Make sense for everyone? The other one here that we have is the things that are unacceptable, the things that we definitely don't want to see, right? Which is we don't want the clinician to approach the session as a triage session or an intake session, which frequently happens in systems where first point of contact is either intake or assessment or whatever. In our model in step care, we want first point of contact to be intervention. Every point of contact to be intervention. So that's why for this, we don't want it to be based on things that came before, because the core component is about a standalone experience, which means to be able to do that, we have to be able to work with what happens in the moment, not with information that precedes it or what happens next. Now, I think somebody asked a question about the thing about the outcomes or how we measure that, and this is how we've measured it: is the clients will actually say that the session focused on their priority. So that's, it's sort of that simple, but the outcomes really are not on kind of what we hope will, or the outcomes are really based on what we hope will happen. And in this column on the very far left, that's the rationale. So that's the mindset. So you can see again how this concept or this framework bridges all of it across the board. Does that make sense? I don't know if that answers the question, Jonas, and Pout, yours. I don't know if that is kind of. Okay, so what am I missing, Pout?
No, I'm intrigued to go through every component and have a look at this in more detail. Is it available on your website?
Not yet. We do have something in the works that hopefully will make all of them available in the very brief future. But yeah, I mean, they will be available. Right now, this is the only one. I mean, I'm happy to, if you just want to email me, I'm sure Alexia, we're good with just kind of going over them, right? And having a discussion, just because I think it's so rich too. So yeah.
There's a lot of potential here. It's really
Yes,
cool. Good work.
Yeah. Beautiful potential. I'm just thinking, however am I going to persuade our system not to do these triages and intakes? I mean, it is so in there, and it's, that's a fight. Yeah, yeah. How have you managed? Or is that a different session altogether?
I don't know,
It
Alexia.
usually takes a pretty brave leader to say, we're not doing this anymore. This isn't work. So we are implementing right now in the whole country of Wales. And there's a leader who said, no more diagnosis-based assessments, no more barriers. We are providing care right away. And
okay, we'll move to Wales. That sounds good.
They developed a mental health strategy that aims to do that. And then what we're doing is to help them implement that strategy, right? Because yes, there's lots of mental health strategies to say open access, care at the point of need. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a few people who don't believe that, but how to actually get to that is hard. It's a big structural change and it's different in terms of how do we train, right? So it usually takes a pretty bold leader, and then it takes time to just, chip away at those system pieces that don't align with this idea.
Yeah. I hope they write a really good case study about that. I think we could use that all across the board. Thank you very much.
Yeah. we're working a little bit in Scotland too, just highlighting for, I see Jenny Clark's from Scotland, working a little bit in Scotland as well, which is fun.
Yeah. So I don't know, just for the last sort of 5 minutes or so, if you want to unshare your screen, I think that's kind of all we've got, isn't it, Alexia? There's nothing too exciting in the rest, just questions, right? Like just sort of like a, what do you think? Kind of a moment. You see it applying, or yeah, what are your thoughts across the board here?
Part of the benefit that we've seen is regardless of the actual content, is that we're talking about the same thing. We've agreed that this is the thing we're implementing. What we mean by client-centered care is this. Now, like Alesya said, that might change a bit over time. We learn things, we adapt it, but at least as a group of people implementing something, do we even agree on what it is that we're implementing? Is often a failure of implementation. We don't really know, like how often have you been asked to do something different in your work, but it's not, you don't actually know exactly what's being asked, right? So that's a fundamental benefit of spending the time, sometimes a painstaking time, to think through, what do we mean exactly by client-centered care, or by open access, or by whatever it might be, so that we have a consensus around what it is that we're trying to implement. And then you can evaluate it, you can train it, you can supervise it. But if it's not well enough defined, it's hard to know how to support it.
Yeah. And research it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, when you think about outcome research, especially, like there's a lot of different things, right? And again, certainly in the world of solution focus, you can watch two people do two different solution focus sessions and they call it solution focused, and it looks super, super different. And I think that's okay. But then how do you replicate it, right? How do you replicate it? How do you do research on it? Right. And I think that what this allows for, and the land of single session therapy literature is the same. Like we struggle with the same thing. Right. I think a lot of it is because, it's difficult for us to do symptom reduction over time measurement, because we're not particularly interested in reducing symptoms. We're interested in growing things. Right. And over time is an assumption that we don't have the luxury of making. So I think also from a research perspective, this opens up a lot of potential, I think. Yeah, Jonas. And then I gotta run.
Sorry, I'm getting carried away already. But I'm just thinking, what a wonderful field to study it is in itself, implementation processes. How do we take the next step? I mean, I'm very much involved with Train the Trainer program. So the more trainers there are out there in organizations working close to the front line and to the leaders, accessible for help and workshopping and stuff like that. But I'm kind of thinking, we could solution focus the implementation process too. How do we do this in a way that actually works? This is hard work, right? So we need to be careful with our time and our efforts. So how can we do this and learn from each other about what actually works to change systems? Because systems change is going to take time and a lot of effort, and just be clear on what's worth doing. And I think I think it's excellent work you're doing. There's a lot to be learned, and I'm just wondering, there's probably a lot more out there, but it's difficult just to synthesize or kind of draw together. So what's actually working when we implement solution focus on scale? What is actually working? But you've given me a lot to think about. I'm really inspired. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, I'm going to have to leave you all now. I'm going to leave you if you have questions, I don't know, for the last 5 minutes, or if people want to go, that's okay. But if you want to see it in action, then move over to my little demo, because this is, I guess, what we're doing next, if you want to see some of these things at play.
Yeah, and feel free to, we didn't put our email. Did we share our emails, or?
I don't think we did, actually. That's a bit of a problem.
Maybe we can at least put them in here. They're pretty easy. I mean, easy and not. So it's just my first name, last name. I'll just put it in the chat because I hear there's many questions, and then Alesya has the same.
Yeah.
With cool, Courtnage.
Are you putting mine in too? Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm typing away as fast as I can.
Well, thank you, Alexia.
There you go. So if you have questions or you want anything we share, just let us know.
Yeah. Good. All right.
Really good presentation. Great presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hope to see you in the coffee bar so we can chat a bit more.
Great. All right.
Bye-bye.
See you
Thank
soon.
you. Bye.